Thank you all again for coming today to the Applied Psychometric Quantitative series talk today as part of the Applied Psychometric Strategies lab here at the University of Kentucky. We have two doctoral candidates, Danny and Abby, who will be presenting on their talk about guiding steps for evaluation or creation of a scale starter kit.
Hi everybody, let's get started. The inspiration for this was really from our life experience going through projects and trying to figure out how do we know if an instrument is good or bad. What is a bad scale question that we thought about is a lot of times people might look at a dissertation, a newly published study, something like that, and they might wonder, is this something that's good to use? Is this something that would be a good source of data for me in my project? And one of the things we really want to highlight is that it really depends. It depends on the type of work that was done and the thoroughness of the study that you're looking at. And so another question we thought of, but will bad measurement really hurt my study? I mean, we're all here to get these degrees. We want to get finished. Will it really be that big of a deal? And so there's really two parts to this, but the resounding answer is yes, this is a big deal. And that's why we're here today. The big picture, beyond just the annoyances that might come about when you're trying to do your work if you use poor measurement, is that poor measurement really is an ethical concern when we're conducting research. Because if the measurement is problematic, the reliability of our findings will be compromised, which basically means that we can't trust our results to the degree that we want to, because we're not entirely sure, is this measuring what we think we're supposed to be measuring? And so our statistical conclusions, the validity of those is going to be questionable as well, which is a really big concern when we're trying to put out new valuable information. At a more personal level, as a researcher, if you use poor measurement, you might have in your sample you're using some particular challenges that might come up for you. For example, you might have low reliability or large measurement error around your scores in your particular sample. You might have uncertainty. Can I use a total score? Is that appropriate for me to do? Or do I need to use subscale scores for each person? You have to actually look at the literature and see what's being done and is there psychometric evidence for that to be appropriate. You might find that not all your response options are being used as you thought they would be. Low item response variability. And additionally, you might find that you have poor factor structure solutions. Things like cross-loadings where items are showing up on multiple factors might come up. Low loadings on factors, so the items just aren't actually loading very strongly at all. Or influences such as item phrasing if you have negative and positively phrased items. All of those might be headaches that you might end up dealing with if you don't, from the get-go, try to find some strong measures that are going to support good measurement in your work. So some examples from my own applied work that really made me think, gosh, this is an important thing for people in applied fields like counseling psych, like ed psych, like school psych, is in my own dissertation, I used this measure, this cognitive flexibility inventory. Very used, very popular. And when I actually went back, I started working with a psychometrician, and I went back and they said, you gotta look at the factor structure on this. You gotta look at how it's been used before, not just that it has been used. And I found, gosh, there's only one paper, the original paper, that's actually looked at how well this is measuring this idea, cognitive flexibility. And when I looked at that paper, I found that there were cross-loadings. So these items weren't loading cleanly on both of the factors they were suggesting. And so when I went to do my own study work, I found that there was a really poor recovery of the factor structure that had been described in this initial study, which created some challenges for me that I had to work through. And I had to do something like reduce the amount of items to get a better fit, which is a controversial thing to be doing. And not something I would have wanted to be doing if I could have avoided it to begin with. Additionally, I did a project where I looked at this scale called the Objectified Body Consciousness Scale. And I looked at, this is a very popular scale used with women primarily, And I thought, I wonder, I was working with a colleague that does a lot of transgender population work. Does this fit for the transgender population? And we looked, and there had been a couple of studies that had used it with transgender folks. And it turned out when we actually analyzed it, it did not fit well. So that suggested that more work needed to be done to make sure that this measure is capturing what it's intending to measure when it's used with the trans population. And if it was being used, that we weren't really sure what it was truly capturing without that additional work. So these are both applied examples of why this stuff is so important to figure out from the get-go. So why does good measurement matter? What are some of the benefits if you take the time to actually find some really awesome psychometric tools? You get lovely things like high reliability, which will result in low measurement error. Things like accurate effect size estimates, better capturing of the effects of interest, like beta, path coefficients. It improves your inferential techniques. You get some more confidence in how you're supposed to score the measure that you're using. All response options could be used, as you are hoping they will be, and strong recovery of the factor structure. So when you go to make sure that in your study that this measure is performing as it was designed, you find, yay, it is. I don't have to worry about that, as opposed to having to deal with challenges related to that. So when you're looking for a scale, some guiding steps to figure out how to evaluate scales are looking at the evaluation of psychological scales in the literature and potentially scale development. If you can't find a scale, what do you need to do to develop a scale to measure your construct of interest? And so those are two of the things we're going to be talking about today. So how do I know if my scale is good, Abby? How do I know?
So I'm going to talk about some sources of evidence for validity that we can look at, and these next few slides, again, are going to focus just on validity and not reliability. But we want to make sure that the good scale, so whether or not we say we've got good, this is going to be a good scale, it'll have multiple sources of evidence. So I'm going to take you through a few different types of validity here in just a second, and we want to make sure that we've got multiple sources of validity evidence in order to say, yes, I've got confidence in the scale. Okay, so the first type, again, we like to use the word sources of validity evidence. So every time we're looking back at our past papers that have used this instrument, we're going to look for how many sources we can find. And we want to find multiple sources. So I'm going to cover 4 of these sources right now. The first is test content, and that answers the question, am I measuring what I intended to measure? In the next slide in a minute, I'm going to talk about where we get these sources, but let's just talk about the definitions of these first. So this is going to be evidence based on test content. Again, is there evidence to say I'm measuring exactly what I intended to measure, or did somebody just pull together items and say this is the construct? Is there evidence for that? The next is response processes. Is there any evidence to say whether or not participants are understanding the scale in the way that I intended? Okay, so did any researchers take the time to check that the people taking the scale, my participants, were actually understanding it the way they were supposed to? Is there any evidence for that? The next is relationships to other variables. Is there any evidence to say that my construct is relating to other variables in the way it should be? Okay, or did I, again, just make a scale and not relate it to other variables in the literature and say, yes, this has evidence-based literature behind it? And then last one is internal structure. So do we have any evidence for the internal structure? So this would be things that we'll talk about in a little bit, like exploratory factor analysis initially, and then later confirmatory factor analysis. And again, is it how I intended to interpret it as well? Is there evidence for that? So we want to look at multiple sources. Again, we don't want just a strong literature review leading to a scale that everybody's using and not the other sources. So a good scale will have multiple sources. So I just want to talk about where and some examples of where places, kind of sources for these that we can look. Again, these are just going to be examples. This is a big area that has lots of options for all of these, but I'll give you a few. So with that test content, again, am I measuring what I intended to measure? You want to look for that strong literature review. Did this scale come out of nowhere, or is it based on strong literature? We can look for things like expert reviews as well. Did the person that originally created the scale and people that have used it since use expert reviews? Did they have an expert look at the scale and say, yes, we're definitely looking at the breadth of the construct. We're looking at how all the different types of ways we can think about the construct, and we've checked it with experts in the field. It wasn't just me, the PI, doing it. That next one, response processes. Remember, that one has to do with how the participants are understanding it. So one way, just one option for that is a cognitive interview. A cognitive interview is a chance for participants, the people you intend to use the scale, to sit down, go through item by item and say, this is what I'm thinking, or this sounds clear to me, and just tell the researcher how they're interpreting each of the items. The researcher then just reflects on how the participants gave that interview and says, yeah, this is exactly as I intended, or, whoa, they're going another direction, I didn't intend this, and then they'll need to think about rewording or changing that item. So again, is there any evidence for these things? These are things we're looking for, that evidence in test content, evidence in response processes, and evidence in the relationship to variables. And that last one is evidence for internal structure. So again, what kind of factor analyses are we seeing? Are we just seeing that initial exploratory factor analysis? Are we seeing follow-up confirmatory factor analyses? Are we seeing any measurement and variance? Are we seeing any evidence that it's only been studied with this population or this sample, like Danny was talking about earlier? Has it only been used for women, or has it been used for this age group? So looking to see that factor structure, that internal structure, has evidence across samples as well. So a good scale, Danny's giving you all the reasons why this matters, but a good scale is going to have evidence in lots of different areas, and it's going to be ongoing. Okay, so we don't want to, again, see that it was only in 1980 and that's the only time that we have evidence for this. We want to see that it's been carried out throughout the life of the scale, and it's continued each time, a new sample or a new way the researchers have used it. So the relations to other variables, so that is, again, remember, making sure that that construct you're trying to measure is relating appropriately to other variables as the literature says. So if I was trying to measure self-efficacy and I created a scale that was the construct of self-efficacy, I would want to make sure it was related to other variables as the literature says it should be. So for example, self-efficacy has been shown to be related to burnout. So I might also collect on a burnout scale that's already established and look for the appropriate relationship between those two variables. If I see a relationship that's not expected, I'm going to start questioning that. And again, we're looking in the past, has anybody else shown that this construct is related as is expected to? Okay, so this next slide is just about what else could we look for. So I told you to make sure we're looking for that ongoing evidence. With validity evidence, we're looking for multiple sources of validity evidence. But we also want to look for the length and the content. So does the scale represent the breadth of the construct? So this is a decision you're thinking about as a researcher. Thinking about, again, let's go back to our self-efficacy example. What is the breadth of the construct I'm trying to measure? And do my items look at all of the breadth of the construct, or does it only look at a little area? So that's just making sure that the items are representing the larger construct and not just a piece of it. And sometimes in my own research, I've found that over the years, it goes from like a long form to a short form. So a measure I've found goes from a long form to a short form. And that's a question I always ask myself if I want to use that short form. Is that short form still addressing the construct and the breadth of the construct, or did we lose some of that along the way? And so I want to make sure I've either got evidence for that, or I can think about the different levels of the construct and decide if that length is appropriate. Again, addressing reliability, so that last few slides address the validity, but thinking about whether or not the reliability is reasonable using similar samples. So this is key. We've got a star here as well, because we want to make sure that the way I intend to use it, again, there's evidence in the past that it's been used that same way. So we want to make sure the samples are very similar.
And really quick, I just want to go back to this reliability piece, because one of the things we also wanted to really address is that some people want us to be, I'm sure y'all came and you would probably want us to give you a threshold. This is what good reliability would be. But unfortunately, it really depends on what you're doing. So you want to be looking at the literature, what the standards are in that specific field, and see, is it appropriate for me to have a reliability of 0.7? Or does it need to be 0.9 in the area that I'm looking at? So it is really specific to the kind of work you're doing, but it's important to do that work to find out what that might be, to move forward, to make sure that it's as reliable as you need it to be for the seriousness and specificity of your work. Some other places that you can look to make sure that your instrument is a solid one is looking at previous samples. Has the sample been used with samples like yours? So that measurement and variance term that Abby was talking about is this idea that, for example, if I'm doing work with LGBT people, is this measure performing with lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender folks all the same way? Is the structure continuing to hold, or is there a change amongst certain groups? And if there is a change, we need to be figuring out what's going on and what's different. But that kind of work should be explored to make sure that with your sample, it's going to be a useful measure that's going to give you information that you're intending to get. And then also intended performance. Has the scale previously performed as intended based on review of past psychometric analyses? So for example, another measure I used in my dissertation, there were a lot of controversial studies about one subscale in this measure not performing as intended. And so figuring out ahead of time, okay, is this, how should I use this? And thinking about what this past literature is telling me would be a really useful exercise before you already collected your data that I would recommend. Scoring, how has the scale been scored in the past? This goes back to that idea of total score versus a subscale score. I think a lot of times we just think, oh, we can just add them up. That's just easy. But actually, you need to, if you think about it, if you actually sit and think about theoretically, like, do you have a reasonable reason? Has the literature demonstrated that it makes sense to add those subscales up? Or are they different things? So you want to look and see how has this been done in the past so you maintain consistency and that there's good evidence for what you're doing. And was sufficient testing done to evaluate the appropriateness of doing it, like I said. And Abby, I wanted to ask you another thing. Is one EFA, one exploratory factor analysis, enough?
No. So we just want to drive home this point before we get into the second part, which is more about scale construction. If I see that we've got this one paper and it's the first time it's been used and they've got a strong EFA behind it, is that enough for me just to go ahead and say, yep, it's a good scale, even if it was good fit? And the answer is no. So we want to make sure we've got that ongoing, repetitive, multiple sources of evidence to say, yes, I've got confidence in this and I feel like this is definitely measuring what I intended to do. And again, we want to focus on the fact that past studies we're reviewing are with our specific sample. So I think that's a step that's often missed. We might see lots of different articles that are using that same scale. Maybe we found it through a literature review or something and we see that it's been used plenty, but I want to make sure that we're all examining the participants and making sure the sample is similar to the way we intend to use it. Did that researcher use it the same way I intended to use it? So one EFA is not enough. Okay, so the next two slides, we're just going to highlight briefly where I can find what we're quoting good scales. And again, this is not a perfect place to look, but this is somewhere that we can see if we've got enough evidence to call it a good scale. So the first place we know is the obvious answer. We can look in literature. So we're going to look back and review that literature on our construct. We're going to pay close attention to the definitions of the construct to make sure they're consistent. We're going to look at reliability, like Danny already talked to us today. We're going to look at the factor structure. How are people looking at it? Are they calling it subscales? Are they calling it total scales, total scores? With that one specifically, again, back to my example on self-efficacy, I've seen, and there's one measure of self-efficacy that's used a lot, and the first time it was validated, the authors said it could either be one total or it could be 3 subscales. From that initial research, people have taken it both those directions, wherever they wanted to. So they've gone off on the unidimensional, and then they've gone off on the subscale. And that's really problematic if we think about it. So the same construct, we're all calling it the same thing. Researchers are taking in two different directions without thinking about the problem that comes with that. So we want to see, is there consistency across the past research with the total score of subscales, and if not, why? And if not, maybe we need to get consistency on that before we can use it. So what kind of EFAs, what kind of CFAs, and then the same thing with the validation sample. Does the sample match? We've drove that home a few times already today, but does their sample match my sample? We just want to highlight one other place you can look. So besides going to literature and getting on Google Scholar and making sure we're looking at the breadth, we can use this tool. It's called the Mental Measurements Yearbook. But we can find so you can search for your construct, or you can search for a specific scale. And if that scale has been around long enough and it's been used enough, then it'll be reviewed. And this is, I can say, just going through it, it's a really strong tool if your scale is going to be in there. So things like the Beck Depression Inventory is there, and that's one of the biggest reviews that I've found on there. There's lots of information about who's used it, which samples they've used it for, what the factor structure is. And again, these reviews are done by people who are experts, so psychometricians, so they're not just done kind of pulled from different studies. So this is just one place. We just wanted to make sure you knew this existed. Again, there's one that comes out, so it started in 1938, and there's one that comes out every year. The most recent was 2017, and it's just that factual information. It pulls it all together for you. So this might be one place to start, and just see if there is a good review on the scale you're wanting to use. Not every scale is there, but just one place to start. Okay, so the next part of the talk that we're going to take you through is, what if, because we've given you so many things to look for, what if you look over and you say, no, I don't have a scale I can rely on, there's not something that I feel like I can use, I need to start from scratch. So what am I going to do? How am I going to develop that instrument? And I want to make the point that we're just going to cover really broadly these steps today. This is a class in itself, if not many, many classes, on how to develop an instrument. But we'll take you through a few of the options that you can start with. And all of the options that we're going through also relate to that validity evidence that I talked about. So now you as the researcher are gathering multiple sources of validity evidence for this scale that you want to start with. So where do we start? Where's our first starting point if we want to develop a scale from scratch? If we say there's nothing in the literature that I feel like I could rely on, we start with that strong systematic review of literature. So this might be in reviews that already exist. This might be in something you have to do completely by yourself. But first, checking, making sure that instrument doesn't already exist. Thinking about what kind of survey response format I want to use, and thinking about the limits and then the breadth of the construct as well. So how big is this construct I'm trying to measure? What are the different parts of the construct I'm trying to measure? And what is it not too? So as a researcher, when I go through this process, I will be doing things like gathering the literature for scales that are similar. I'll be gathering literature for scales for research that helps me understand what that construct is, so that I can really strongly say, okay, now I know what I'm trying to measure. I know who's done something similar, and I feel like I can now gather items. I can start making a list of items. And when I'm also at this stage, I always keep a Google document as well with lots of the items running. Just even if I don't think they'll be there in the end, when I'm getting ideas, this is where I can get that large pool of items. And we're going to do steps later on to get down to an actual scale. But this is a good stage to just gather item pool. And with that item pool, I also keep track of where I'm getting those items. Where are they coming from? Is it coming from a scale that's similar? Is it coming from an article that talks about the breadth of the construct? Is it coming from some other literature that I've read? Again, I want to track this well. So I want to track where my items are coming from and where this breadth of construct is coming from. And so this is all, if you remember those validity evidence, sources for validity evidence that I talked about, this is all getting our evidence for test content. The next part is this repetitive item writing. So now that I've really reviewed literature, I feel like I have a firm belief, firm understanding of what my construct is. I can go through this process of repetitive item writing. So starting with that large pool of items, thinking about the multidimensionality of the construct. Is this one thing? Am I going to be measuring different subscales? Again, we don't have to make a decision on the factor structure right now, but thinking about the multidimensionality of the construct is important in this stage. What is it? What is it not? With each item, we're going to think about things like clarity and level of difficulty as well. Am I writing items that are really easy, or am I writing items that are all really hard? When we do this repetitive item writing stage, we want to write items that are across the difficulty level. So when I think about my participants taking them, I want items that are a little easier for them to go work through, and then ones that'll make them stop and think a little bit more. I want across that difficulty level. And again, just creating items that are reflecting whether or not this construct is unidimensional, multidimensional, the different subparts of it, just making sure I get that breadth. And at this stage, again, don't try to limit yourself thinking like, oh, I want to make a scale that's easy to use, or I want to make a scale that's quick. At this stage, it's large. I don't have any limits. I'm writing every item that I think might fall into this construct for now. Okay, so we've gathered this item pool. We've done this repetitive going through items and saying, okay, I think I've got the breadth. I think I've got the multidimensionality. I've looked at my items and decided if they're clear and concise, at least from my point of view. But now I need to get some point of view of others. So this is the evidence that I'm going to be gathering about the response processes that's specific to what are the experts in the field saying. Experts not being me. Okay, so this is what you'll go out and you'll seek review from those that are in the field. So this could be, I can give you an example. In my own work, I wrote a scale about self-efficacy for autism, so I used experts in autism, but also experts in self-efficacy research. And I ask them similar questions, but mostly it's things like, is this item reading clear and concise for you? But then also, am I getting the breadth of the construct? So for those autism researchers, making sure that I'm getting the breadth of what autism is and how teachers would be interacting with people with autism. And then with the self-efficacy research, am I really getting the breadth of self-efficacy here? Are there difficulty items and all those different ways? And there's different ways you can do external review. My personal favorite is to use a Qualtrics form that has each item come up and then choices underneath. But again, there's different ways you can do this. But here we're just seeking consistency across experts. So if an expert comes up and says this item isn't clear, or I don't think you've gotten the breadth of the construct, then you go back to the stages you write, back to that repetitive item writing and thinking about your items. And you want to keep this external review going until you feel like you've really got consistency, until your experts are saying, yes, you've got the breadth of the construct. This is not a stage to go too quickly to either, to go too quickly through as well. When I've been reading other studies, I kind of see it in one line sometimes, and I question whether or not, what that meant. Did they show it to a professor or an advisor and say, okay, they checked it off? So I think that if we go too quickly through this, we can make a mistake that through our own eyes, this is a good scale, and not look at how other people are understanding this, those experts in the field. So we want to slow down at this part and make sure the experts are really saying, yes, this is good. Okay, so with one more point with this evidence for response processes, after I do the expert reviews, I like to do my cognitive interviews then. So if my experts have said, yes, you've got the breadth, it's clear, I probably deleted some items now that aren't clear, or deleted some items the experts say aren't needed. I've got a set of items now that I think are good. Even if it's a little too many now, that's okay. That next stage is going on to the cognitive interviews, and I talked about those before. But that's a chance to sit down with who you intend to use the scale on. So if it's a scale for teachers, then you're sitting down with teachers only. If it's a scale for university students, you're picking that same age group. And you're asking them to think through each item and just asking them to think aloud. So I would put one item up on a piece of paper and have them read it. And I'd just say, okay, tell me what you're thinking. And me as a researcher, I'm just making some notes, probably transcribing it to make sure I'm hearing the right answers and hearing consistency, again, across the people I'm interviewing. All right, so these stages will get me a final item inclusion list, and then I'll be able to go through the statistical analysis. So this is where I can have some research questions about the internal structure. So what are the psychometric properties of my scale? What's the internal structure of my scale? And this is where we can gather that evidence for internal structure from the validity list that we showed you earlier. So this is, if it's the first time I'm doing it, I'm doing an exploratory factor analysis. So this is, again, where I can have a research question about the internal structure and then test it. This next point is the relations to other variables in this stage as well. This is where I'm going to collect some data on other variables that the literature says should be related to my construct and just check that relationship. Again, is this intended? Is the relationship coming out as literature says it is? And if it's not, I need to stop and think about why. Is that appropriate? Is it a new construct that I don't have literature for? Or should it be behaving a little bit differently? Or can I confirm that with the relationship? With this relationship point as well, you'll be collecting, a good idea is to collect data on variables that should be related, but then also variables that shouldn't be related. So you'll check the relationships of both. So with that self-efficacy and burnout, those should be related. The literature says they should be. But then I also might collect data on something that literature says these two are not related. So I'll collect on both, again, just to gather more sources. All right, so thinking about this process, again, as an ongoing process, the first time you do all these steps, you're not writing a paper and saying, okay, this is good to go, anybody use it all you want. This is going to be your initial psychometric evidence for the scale. If you feel like you can gather enough sources to use it and you feel like you've got the evidence to say, okay, now I'm good to use it, this can be the first step in using it. But again, think about it as an ongoing process. So come back to it with other samples. Come back to it with larger samples and other work in the future. Don't check this off and say, okay, I've done that, now I can move on to talking about the scale as a good quality, perfect scale. But this is going to get you to that initial step. Repeated this many, many times, but Danny and I just wanted to drive it home one more time. This is this ongoing process we want to build each time. So all those steps I just gave you, going through each one would be that first little tiny block, okay? And that's good, and that's a great first step, and it's going to allow you to use that scale, hopefully, in your next papers, but it's just that little tiny block. We want to gather it along the way with lots of additional samples and other work. We're going to have this posted, but we put some helpful references for scaled construction. Again, there's many. These are some of my favorites and some that were recommended to us, but just wanted to make sure this was on here. This first one will give you a lot of information on the validity evidence, the sources for validity evidence that we worked through. So that'll talk through the test content, relationship to other variables. It'll tell you a little bit about expert reviews and cognitive interviews. It's a good resource. So if you don't have any of these, that's one place I would say to start.
So we wanted to, really provide an overview today of some really important foundational pieces, but we weren't able, in only an hour, we weren't able to go over everything. So we also wanted to leave you with some inspiration of things to kind of continue investigating and exploring. So some other things that we didn't have time to review are things like best practices in doing exploratory factor analysis and a confirmatory factor analysis, bi-factor analyses, SEM, IRT, cognitive diagnostic models, measurement and variance testing, how to actually do that. Even if you understand the concept, you might not know how you actually perform those tests. And multi-level SEM and IRT, all really, really awesome, cool techniques that will help you understand your data at a deeper level and understand your measures that you're using at a deeper level. That's really, really important. Again, going back to that first slide, that it's about really being ethical in how we're doing our research. And then also, the side effect of that will also be that you have less of a headache when you're doing your work as well. So if you're interested in some of these areas, we have some good news for you. Our lab has other talks that you can go investigate on things like how to do a bi-factor analysis, how to do measurement and variance, how to do mediation. So there's a lot of good information out there that you can go explore for yourself as well if this is intriguing to you. And so what we hope you got out of this hour talk that we've been doing, we really want you to be able to think twice before using a scale to measure the construct that you're passionate about. Good measurement really matters, and we hope you heard that as many times as we repeated it. Instrument development is an ongoing process. This is not a one-time thing, and we hope you consider gathering psychometric evidence to support the intended use of the scale that you use in your study. And that is the AQPS lab talk on measurement. And anybody have any questions? Thank you for being here.